I mean,
Welcome to the first session of our course on fascism at Unregistered Academy. We are joined today by John Foote, who is are you in Bristol?
I'm in Bristol, yes.
You are a professor of, is it right, modern Italian history at the University of Bristol? Right.
That's right, yeah.
Um, you've published widely. You're incredibly prolific, by the way. I wanted to say that. Very, very impressed with your output. But I guess it's your most recent book, right? Of last year, early last year, 2022, which
22 it came out, yeah.
called Blood and Power: The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism. I mean, I think it's safe to say that you are one of the leading experts on Italian fascism in the world, and I'm really happy because of that for you to be here to talk with us about it, what it really was. Um, and your book, Blood and Power, is unusual, maybe unique in the historiography of Italian fascism, and that it tells the story of the rise of the fascists and fascism in Italy through the story of individuals, various individuals, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 of them, who are sort of across the spectrum politically, and what it meant for them, and how the rise of fascism affected them, not just in their lives, but in their bodies, because violence is so important in your telling. I think pretty much every page there's pretty horrific acts of violence being carried out. But I want to start actually not with the history. I want to start with, and you'll understand this because you're a professional historian. I want to start with the history of the history.
Mm.
Can we talk about the historiography of Italian fascism, which is vast? I understand that there's, sure. But I mean, whenever I teach a course on a major subject in US history, that's where I start. I say,
Yeah,
okay, here are the ways in which other historians have characterized this thing we're about to talk about. And then I invite the students to sort of intervene in that debate and say, and I've sort of asked them to pick a side, in fact, but just to see what's at stake in this, and that there's never been there is no unified absolute truth about history, right? And I think that's the best way to do that. So can you give us like a sketch? Don't need to go into too much detail, but how has the rise and fall of Italian fascism been viewed by historians since 1945?
um, I would, I don't want to contest your question. I go a little bit further back than that,
Okay.
um, to the sort of 2030s, really.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, as you said, there's an
Right.
enormous,
Right.
enormous production. It's one of the most written about things, I think, in history. That no one really knows how many books and articles have been published, and I've only looked at what's in English and Italian, and if you go beyond that, there's another vast amount in other languages. So it is huge. But if I was to pick out some threads, I'd say there's one thread that perhaps is a kind of classical Marxist thread, which is quite popular early on, which kind of characterizes fascism as basically an arm of the ruling class. So fascism is what is used, is a weapon used by the landlords, the factory owners, to smash the left. And that's a very crude, but quite a popular thread that in some ways is still around, but was in particular in the early. And if you're going to use kind of class analysis, that's where you might go. I mean, no one really does that anymore, but
Hmm.
that was a popular way of understanding Italian fashion. So they're basically a sort of tool in
Mm-hmm.
in, in the arm of the working class. They're the armed wing of capitalism, if you like, and that's an interesting thing to discuss. We could talk
Mm-hmm.
about that. There are some elements of Italian fascism that certainly chime with that. Um, I think there's another part which talks another kind of historiography, which talks very much of continuity.
Mm.
So yes, there's fascism. Yes, democracy is destroyed, but there are what's really changing is not very much. Um,
Hmm.
the church is still around, the institutions are around, the monarchy's around, So there's that kind of continuity, which is quite popular. There's quite a big school, if you like, which
Hmm.
kind of sees it as a parenthesis, as Benedetto Croce called it.
Mm.
It's Italian history is kind of this is formed in Italy's formed in the 19th century. It goes on till today, and there's this bad like black mark of 20 years, but that's
Mm-hmm.
not really Italy. That's not really what happened. it's kind of, it just goes off on a bit, veers off onto something else, but it's
It's an
not really
an aberration. Is that what you would call
an
it?
aberration,
Yeah.
something in brackets, a sort of,
Uh,
yeah, that kind of, and I think there are, that's quite, you can still see signs of that in quite a lot of historians who have looked at continuities, and someone like Richard Bosworth, who's quite a popular historian of, he would very much be on that kind of line. A lot of the British historians of Italy also would probably buy into, traditionally would buy into that line.
okay. Wait,
Um,
let me stop you there. I'm not totally clear. So
yeah, sure.
is there a school of thought that says that that it did represent continuity with Italian history, or is it just aberrationists?
It's sort of like it didn't really change very much. I think
So
that's the
there's
that's the
both.
way.
I
That's
mean,
a very simplistic way of seeing it. So Italy remains more or less the same. There's no
oh, I
revolution.
see. Okay.
It doesn't really alter
I see. Got
Italy
it.
very much.
Got it.
It's despite the bombast of the fascists, of course, who say year zero revolution, we've
Right.
changed everything. So there's that kind of
Right.
line.
Right.
Then you've got sort of very influential is someone called Emilio Gentile,
Mm-hmm.
who talks, who is probably the most influential historian of post-war historian of Italian fascism.
Mm.
And he talks about the attempt to create, so he very much takes the fascists seriously. He talks about fascism as an attempt to create a new religion. He doesn't think it was entirely successful, but he sees it through that prism, which is often talks a lot about culture and cultural change, cultural processes in fascism. And that's been incredibly influential on other historians who've studied all kinds of cultural things that fascism has done, like art, architecture, all kinds of things. So there's a lot of production there. You might call that the cultural turn, if you
Okay.
want to be,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I would say I'm part of this kind of fourth wave,
Mm.
which is to rediscover. So a lot of these three, I think, would all play, maybe not the Marxist one, but the two and the three would all play down very much the violence of fascism,
Oh,
um, or say it was only important for a little bit, or it wasn't
right.
very much.
Hmm.
Whereas recent years, someone like Giulia Albanese, who's an historian, Italian historian of fascism, have reintroduced and re-examined the violence and put the violence back at the heart.
Okay.
And that's kind of all the school I was in. And they also very much about using everyday life history,
Mm-hmm.
which comes from Germany originally,
Mm.
and then is being applied in recent years by some amazing historians, including, I would cite one American historian who I think very influential on me, called Michael Ebner, who wrote a book called Ordinary Violence in Mussolini's Italy, which I think is a
Mm.
much underrated and should be more well-known book, very important book for me, talking about how violence went all the way through the regime and sort of patterned the way the regime worked, and also trying to combat that constant confrontation with Germany. So Italian fascism is often seen as mild and benign
Mm-hmm.
when you compare it with Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is mild and benign when you compare it with Nazism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also of that. There's quite a lot of stereotypes attached to Italian, the way people look at Italy often, that they're kind of
Right.
peace loving and music playing, mandolin carrying,
And not
kind of,
anti-Semitic.
and not anti-Semitic. They're just forced into that for
Right.
sort of opportunistic reasons.
Right.
By and so I'm this recent stuff is rediscovering the violence also in the colonies.
Mm.
Um, so
Mm.
those are kind of some of the schools. I think that's what, it's probably enough on that, but there
Yeah.
is there will be a lot, there will be other things to say.
Okay. Yeah, we're certainly gonna pick up this question of the importance of violence when we get into the sort of the heart of it. But let's now thank you for that. That's really useful and interesting. And I'd like for all of us to think about these various schools of thought as we're going through the history now. And this is what I always ask my students: like, check it, see which, this whatever data point we're looking at, does it support which school of thought? Let me let's do the history, the basic history, just so people are sort of oriented. And I actually want to start in the 19th century with you, and I'm not sure what work you've done on this particular question. I'm sorry to say, but when I've taught the ideology of fascism, and I've looked at sort of American, what I consider to be American remnants of fascism. I start with the church. Now, I start with the Rerum Novarum, the papal encyclical that sort of lays out kind of what many people have called the philosophy of corporatism, in which the church says basically we need to sort of organize society as a family where, and they're very concerned about class conflict at the time. This is in the 1880s, 90s, 91, I think it was. And they say, well, because there's all strikes and riots and lots of class conflict in Italy at the time. Well, what we need is for the capitalist class, the owning class, to be benign paternalists, to be sort of the fathers over their workers. And we need, likewise, we need the workers to behave like loyal children, essentially, to the company, but also then the head of the state. So the state also needs to be organized in a corporate way, meaning as a family. I mean, that's how I read it. And then you see corporatism as an economic model kind of arise with the early Italian fascist intellectuals or proto-fascist intellectuals in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, and then it comes over to the United States in a big way, and then to Germany in a big way too. And you see actual corporatist economic models enacted in both those countries. Um, that's at least my telling, and I'm slightly nervous telling you this, but I'm warning because I know way less than you do about this. But where do you place it, and the importance of the church and that encyclical and that sort of idea of corporatism how important is it? Did I get this wrong?
No, I don't think you got it wrong. I mean, that's a
Okay.
really interesting take, actually.
Oh.
I must say,
Hmm.
I don't go back that far in. I mean, obviously, I have worked on that period in the past, but I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about fascism. Basically, says it's going to abolish the class struggle,
Right.
which is very similar to what you're saying about the church doesn't like the class struggle,
Right.
or
Yeah.
at least says it doesn't like the class struggle.
Yeah.
Um, and I think fascism, as a regime, it's different from when it's rising, but when it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a regime, the
Mm-hmm.
first fascist regime in the world, I think it's always important to underline that this is a model for everyone else. It's the first fascist movement, the first fascist regime. The name is Italian, etc., etc. It sets up it says that what it wants is a state where everybody is on the same side,
Yeah.
and organized in a kind of scientific, technocratic way, so that and the state is a very powerful body in Italian fascism. There's the famous quote of Mussolini: "Everything, nothing outside the state, everything inside the state, nothing above the state." The state is kind of almost fetishized.
Yes.
I can say that word.
Yes.
Why
Yes.
did I go down that road of saying that word?
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think I was talking in class today about the deal that Mussolini makes with the church, and we might come back to this, but he does a deal in 1929, which is kind of the maximum point of, which brings a lot of popularity to the regime, a deal with the church,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
it's not just a practical deal. It's not just a deal about, there is quite a lot of that going on. We're going to give you a lot of privileges and rights and solidify them. But it's also an ideological
Mm-hmm.
deal, I think,
Mm-hmm.
about both of them are very, very solidly anti-Marxist,
Mm-hmm.
anti-class struggle,
Mm-hmm.
and they come at that in different directions, I think, but there is an agreement there. So I think that's a really interesting way of seeing it.
Okay.
Uh, Now, whether that's the reality
Yeah.
is, I think, a different matter. Whether that
Mm.
actually is how
Mm.
things are in Italy, or
Mm.
is a different proposition, I think.
After they take power, you mean?
Well, both after and before,
Huh.
whether they do abolish class struggle or whether that is a propagandistic, um, you know, tactic is an interesting question. I'm not saying I'm coming down on this side, but I think that we have to always doubt what the fascists are saying about
Sure,
themselves.
sure.
And I think that's one of the problems with one of those schools I talked about, is it tends to take the fascists a little bit at face value.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this is bombast and propaganda. I think we have to be very careful with that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean I'm thank you for saying that because next session we're going to look at some of the key texts in the original Italian fascist among the intellectuals. And that's where I go often when I study. I'm very much a textualist, I suppose. But you're right. There you need to like check it against the actual history too, right? Like, I mean, what these people said is very important, I think, and needs to be
Yeah.
taken seriously, but you also need to take seriously what they actually did, how
Yeah.
they behaved, how they enacted these words. So yeah. All right, let's talk now about Italy between the 1890s and World War One, which is kind of that's the pre-fascist era. Certainly, I mean, looking back retrospectively, that's how we think about it. Anyway, and um, I really, I really want to hear about the left in Italy
Mm.
during that time because that to me that is maybe the big story in that period. Because of course, anti-socialism, anti-radicalism, anti-communism, we all agree was central in Italian fascism. Um, and I wonder to what extent was that paranoid? I don't think it was actually. I mean, right? That's this is the thing because that's how the way
Not
it's fascist.
paranoid for sure.
Fat
Not paranoid. No,
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 right.
no.
But fascism is often fascists are often portrayed as being paranoid, right? Especially modern day fascists. Oh, what are they worried? They talk about globalists and oh, who cares?
Mm.
And the
Mm.
Davos and whatever. But when they were anti-communists in the 1920s, this was a serious position to take. So why don't
Sure.
you can you just sketch out what you think are the important through lines in Italian history those 2 decades in terms of, especially in terms of the left? I mean, I know sort of the rich Italian history of anarchism and communism and socialism and Gramsci and all that, but I don't really have a sense of like exactly how big was it? How aligned with the Soviet Union were they after the Bolshevik Revolution? What were their politics precise? I know you've talked about this a lot, and you've talked about how they sort of changed the left in Italy, but can you just do that and because I think that really, to me, more than anything, sets the ground.
Yeah, it's also interesting to note that a lot of the characters we might meet later, including
Mm,
Mussolini himself, were on the left
yeah,
um, in that period that you mentioned.
that's right.
And they weren't just on the left, they were leading figures in the left.
Right, right,
There
right.
is that very important point.
Hmm.
So you have Italy is a young country with an old history. So it's a newly unified country. It's only in the 1890s, only
Oh,
25 years old. But of
that's
course, it isn't. It's much
right,
older than that. In
right,
each, I mean, each city is thousands of years old, so they have different
right.
traditions. But as a unified country, with Rome as capital against the church, it's a young country. It's a country with a lot of social issues, divisions, extreme levels of class conflict,
Mhm,
leading to quite high levels of state violence against, for example, strikers, or
mhm,
people are very often killed during strikes, shot. Um, there are two moments where the state of siege is announced in different parts of Italy in the 1890s. The state is a fairly weak and doesn't have much legitimacy in many parts of Italy. There's high levels of crime and inequality. So, it's a difficult country to govern. It's been kind of forced together by a very small minority, the kind of passive revolution that Gramsci talked about, which was the unification of Italy. And you've got a growing left, which is really divided into two. You've got a socialist party, which is partly reformist and partly revolutionary. And then you've got quite a strong anarchist movement,
yeah,
which is obviously revolutionary,
yeah.
which causes revolts and some very charismatic characters who turn up also in my book at various times, extraordinary sort of
Yeah,
romantic revolutionaries.
yeah.
Um, and at various times you get these revolts. I actually started my book well before the First World War because I wanted to capture these revolts, and they're often against militarism. They're often against the army.
Hmm.
There's a very strong streak in Italian history of anti-war activism.
Mm,
So when you get to the war, you can imagine the
mm,
divisions.
mm,
For example, in 1914, I talk about something called Red Week, where there was a kind of insurrection across parts of central Italy, sparked by the shooting dead of people on a sort of Republican anti-militaristic demonstration,
mm,
which spread very quickly across, felt a bit like a revolution. It wasn't, but it felt like one. It scared people. And I think when you get to fascism, the fear of a revolution, the fear of chaos, the fear of communism
mm,
later. There's no communism at this point, really. I would say communism becomes a thing after 1917. People start calling themselves communists, although they may well be exactly the same as that
right,
before.
right.
Um, so you've got, it's a period of turbulence, rebellion, division, violence, social violence, and the left is growing, both in all these different manifestations. And Mussolini, who will clearly meet again, is, a very leading figure in the revolutionary left of the Socialist Party. He's a he's a he's a amazing speaker, a
Mm,
journalist,
mm-hmm,
writer,
mm-hmm,
charismatic figure. So
mm.
he's very anti-war. He goes to prison
Oh,
for opposing the invasion of Libya by Italy.
didn't know that. Oh,
Yeah, goes to prison
oh.
for making anti-war speeches. So
Hmm.
he, he becomes the ultimate turncoat, if you like, for the
Yeah.
left later on.
Huh.
So I mean, um, it's also a country with an economy, a very fragile economy, largely an agrarian country at this point, with pockets of very sophisticated industry, but almost entirely in Turin, Milan in the north, mostly an agrarian country, but with a very powerful agrarian workers movement. And that will be the kind of focus in the areas where the agrarian workers movement starts to become very powerful. The trade union movement starts to create its own institutions, its own libraries, its own sort of very powerful trade unions. That's where fascism will also grow.
Hmm.
In those areas, precisely in those areas, is where fascism will become strongest. So
Hmm.
that's not by chance.
Hmm. Sounds like a horseshoe theory, a little bit, right? That fascism, I mean, I'm not necessarily subscribing to this, but like horseshoe theorists would like this information you're giving them, right? Someone like Mussolini sounds representative of a lot of fascists, but they're sort of the radicals on the right and the radicals on the left are in the same places, and sort of interested in the same institutions and questions even, right? But they have sort of there's just a radicalism about them that in some ways brings them closer. I don't know. Although of course they become
I don't think that's mistaken. I think you do get crossover.
okay.
There's not a clear dividing line. That we like to draw these lines as if there was a left and a right, and we could clearly see who was fascist and anti-fascist, but that isn't the case. But
Interesting.
also, when you get, I would say, Italian fascism is the first movement to embrace a kind of radical nationalism, which is, you know, carries elements of the left, but marries it with a very strong sense of nationalism, an extreme
Mm-hmm.
sense of nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
also uses the language and sometimes the policies of the left.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see some of that continues all the way through the regime
Mm-hmm.
to some extent, although a lot of it is thrown away.
Okay.
Um, so the origins, it isn't that Mussolini becomes a different person in 1915. He still has a lot of that baggage and uses it to create something which is very powerful as an ideology, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the rise of the left is essential, and then the war is the other, I think, essential background for this, for the rise of fascism. So Italy enters in 1915. It's funny, and I know you've talked about this elsewhere, but it's true that we don't really think about Italy in World War One. We don't. And what was it? More than 500,000 were killed. But yet they're not even. Even I had to sort of remind myself. Of course, they entered and they were in it, but like I can't think of it. Just they don't arise in the popular consciousness when we think about World War One. So what was the in most countries, certainly in the United States, even in Western, as far as I know, I think it was widely unpopular among the masses in every country, and that's why they relied on mass conscription to fight that war in every country, I think. And was Italy the same? What was the general feeling about entering the war among Italians at the time?
It's a minority, a small minority that wants to go into the war. Mostly the opposite, the attitude of the vast majority, and we have quite strong evidence on this, is either indifference or hostility to the war. It's a largely conscript army. There are volunteers, but they're mostly middle class people,
Hmm.
officers. There's no rush to join up like there is, for example, in England and Scotland, and there is a much more nationalist fervor around the war. So Italy's pushed into the war by a small nationalist, very active minority, and this is really important because
Yeah.
they're using techniques of street violence there, which will then reappear. So it's a kind of dress rehearsal for post-war Italy. It's called the Radiant May by the fascists. They're not fascists then, but the people who will become fascists by the radical nationalists. And very important to that is a man who I think is an important figure in all this, called Gabriele D'Annunzio,
Hmm.
who is a poet, filmmaker, aesthete, who is a kind of spin doctor of Italian fascism. He comes up with the slogans, he comes with the tactics, he comes up with the uniforms.
Hmm.
You know, he's a kind of genius, political genius. He never really becomes a fascist, but he kind of is bringing a lot of the ideas and the kind of clothing and the sort of
Hmm.
the infrastructure, the paraphernalia.
And
So they
the
this
affect.
radiant, yeah,
Hmm.
he's sort of a
Hmm.
political
Hmm.
genius in many ways. Um, so this small minority, along with elites like the king and some economic elites, push Italy into the war against the wishes of which are not tested of the vast majority of the people. There's no vote on this or anything. There is most of Parliament is against it, to be honest. Most
Hmm.
of Parliament is liberal and pacifist, so it's against their interests as well
Hmm.
or desires. And as in all countries in the First World War, most people think it's going to be over, in a few months, and it isn't. And it's an horrific, as in all countries, butchery of peasants, basically.
Hmm.
Um, but it has contradictory effects, and I think this is important. It brings together large numbers of people for the first time across Italy. It kind of many historians talk about it creating Italians,
Hmm.
trenches. Uh,
Hmm.
so people from Sardinia, people from Sicily, people who didn't even speak
Hmm.
Italian,
Hmm.
coming together as Italians in this
Hmm.
kind of brutalistic experience,
Hmm.
um, and becoming Italians in some weird way, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
Hmm.
it's always important, and this is another thing that's often recognized. Italy wins the war, despite a very problematic war. They do
Hmm.
win it. They take part in it. They use a lot of hundreds of thousands of people die, but they win it. But it's seen as a victory immediately afterwards. In D'Annunzio's word, a mutilated victory. It's a victory on the battlefield, but they don't get much out of it. And that is one of the great
Hmm.
disaffections that fascism
Hmm.
into. We've been humiliated afterwards. We all these people died, all this bloodshed. And the one other thing to underline quickly is that there's a huge division over the war politically. Many socialists oppose it, and trade unionists.
Hmm.
Many don't. Like
Hmm.
Mussolini changed his mind. Very important. He goes from anti-war to pro-war in 1915. Is kicked out of the Socialist Party,
Hmm. Hmm.
forms his own newspaper.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that will be the prototype of fascism. Many
Yeah.
socialists sort of desert and kind of almost sabotage, and that creates not just a political division, but a very deep-rooted sense of hatred across the divide. It's more than politics. It's like traitor against warmonger. You know, it's very deep, and that will explain a lot of the violence, I think.
So, okay, so Italy joined in an alliance with other countries, with including England and France,
And
uh,
America.
and America ultimately.
Yeah.
And it was very much, I mean, we think of it over here, I mean, among historians, it's kind of like the first, in a sense, globalist moment. I mean, first globalist war. I mean, that was How Wilson conceived of it, right? Internationalist, globalist, whatever you want to call it. And so, what in the world are ultranationalists who become fascists doing, supporting entry into this stupid globalist bankers war, right? What the hell? What's that? I mean,
They they want to complete the unification of Italy. That's their sort of dogma. So there are bits of Italy they think are Italian, bits of other countries they think of Italian. They want to conquest them. So there's a kind of fourth risorgimento idea,
like the
and that
colonies, the colonies.
no, like
Oh,
bits of Germany, bits of Serbia.
oh,
You know, Italy's right on the front line of all that, right?
oh,
The
okay,
colonies they also want, but that's
yeah.
a kind of slightly different story. And that brings in a lot of kind of moderate people as well,
Huh.
who also believe, oh yes, Italy wasn't fully unified, so this is a war. Finally, we can become Italians because we fought in a proper war, right? So that gathers a fairly wide alliance. Um, and then there are all kinds of other interests involved in this: economic interests, territorial interests, alliances of all various kinds
Okay.
that that play out. Italy wins the war, but I don't think it's rude to say that that is partly because of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian empire, of which their main rival, really, although they
Hmm.
are also fighting the Germans, but the main war was between Italy and Austria. Um,
And so they did not get that territory.
They
That's what
got
they're.
bits, but they
Uh-huh.
didn't get anywhere near what they wanted.
And
And
that's the humiliation.
that's the humiliation. The
Yeah.
Paris Peace Conference,
Sure.
um, they're kind of ignored quite a lot.
Oh.
And, um, and that's where D'Annunzio coins this very powerful phrase, the Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory, which is a kind of genius phrase. Um, we've shed our blood and we've been humiliated. And he then kind of foresees fascism by taking a ragbag army of volunteers and marching on one of the places they wanted, which is a small town called Fiume. And he occupies that against completely against the law, illegal act. And he occupies that and becomes a kind of duce of this area.
Hmm.
There's some fantastic material on this,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that kind of prefigures a lot of what fascism will do as well.
Hmm. Um, so Versailles, I guess I definitely didn't quite notice this, I guess. So Versailles becomes similar in the Italian fascist consciousness as it does in the German Nazi consciousness. Yeah, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, not as powerful because Italy wins, but
Yeah, right.
the humiliation's not as great, but it's definitely a similar way of framing it for sure. And it's this sort of, you know, we must redress this. And if you're not going to do it, if you liberal government people aren't going to do anything about it, then we're going to have to take it into our own hands. We're going to have to take up arms as a
Right.
private army, as an illegal army, as a militia, whatever you want to call it.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And the way you talk about um the rise of um the black shirts, uh the rise of fascism in the streets, I mean it does, that's how it feels to me. It feels like a guerrilla insurgency against what they consider to be foreign invaders, right? I mean, in a sense, right? Even, I mean, even if you were born in Italy, if you're a communist, to them, you're simply right. You're representing not Italy. You're representing an enemy, an external enemy. But yeah, and that's the core, I think, to your book and your argument. But let's see. The Okay, so the first meeting of uh people calling themselves fascists is in 1919. Why don't you take it from there? So within 3 years, they seize power. That's pretty quick. What is the scene in Italy in 19 after the war? I mean, chaos is the first word you might use, but and yeah, just sort of sketch out those 3 years leading up to the seizure of power in 22.
So Italy wins the war in, I think, November 18. The armistice is signed,
Right. Mm-hmm.
4th of November. Um, and then you've got what many historians will call the two red years, although there's quite a lot of debate about that. Bienno Rossa, 1919 to 20. You've got strikes, rebellions, some places things that look like revolutions,
Mm.
factory occupations, uh, street violence. The left does very well in the elections of 1919. So it feels like, and you've had the Russian Revolution, of course.
Right.
A lot of people in Italy are saying we've got to do what they do as they did in Russia. You know, that's the mantra for many,
Mm-hmm.
even people, even moderate socialists. But you've got a revolutionary wing which is getting bigger and bigger, calls themselves the Maximalists. Amidst this, a small number of people in March 1919 get together in Milan. And this has obviously becomes much bigger in retrospect than at the time, because this is an historic moment, not just for Italy, for the world. This is the first fascist meeting in history. It gives the word fascism to the world. And it's in a specific place. It's an interesting place to go to if you want to go to Milan, because now
Oh
it's
yeah.
now a Carabinieri um, station in
Oh,
Milan.
police station.
There's no sign about this. There's no plaque.
Uh,
But fascism obviously had many commemorations around. They loved commemorations.
huh.
Now you just know, if you know where to go, you go there. It's a very interesting place. I always take people there when I go to Milan.
And it's a
Uh,
police station now.
Police station, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a police.
Okay.
But it was a fascist place. I mean,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can see the architecture. It's a massively built sort of fascist building, but it was made a police station, I presume, in 45 or 46.
Hmm.
So they had this meeting. Mussolini was in charge. It was a ragbag group of mostly people who fought in the war, nationalists, radical nationalists. D'Annunzio wasn't there.
Hmm.
And they came out with a pretty radical program that would be seen as radical left, I think, by anybody now. Very progressive taxation, um,
Hmm.
anti-clerical stuff.
Hmm.
That's still that radical, but nationalist stuff as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very strong stuff about soldiers, anti-socialist radicalism. That's the kind of line they're going
Mm-hmm.
in their program. It's not taken too seriously at that time. People laugh at, it's kind of slightly a joke.
Wow.
And they are also, however, starting to organize kind of militia and with guns. And they had their kind of first act of fascist violence is April 1919, Milan. There's rioting in the streets. Socialists are shooting as well, and a small group of fascists march on the printing press of the socialist newspaper, burn it down. And they will often do this. They often burn buildings down, and 4 people are killed. And this is celebrated again and again as the first act of violent fascism. We're expunging the left, right? So much of the violence. So 1919 to 20, it's kind of the red years are red years of revolution, of riots, of rebellions. There's a lot about that in my book.
Yeah.
Um, and fascism is organizing from a very small base. It never has a large amount of people
Right.
against this, using violence, but also using propaganda as well, and words and articles to mobilize against what they see as what you said at the start. They see these people as not Italian, as anti-national, as foreign agents, as traitors. It's a civil war of kind which is going on, which makes why it's so bitter as
Right.
well.
Right. And they weren't entirely wrong about that. I mean, that's what it meant to be an international socialist, right? I mean, that's what you were. This is what Marx said, the working class knows no borders. I mean, it's true. I mean, I've always been an internationalist, of a kind. I've always been anti-nationalist. In a sense, I consider myself a foreign agent within my own country. In a sense, right? I mean, and so how the left as of 1919, Like how big is the CP, whatever the CP was called in Italy, that was actually officially aligned with the Soviet Union, right? That's
This period, there isn't one.
okay.
So that formed in 1921.
Okay.
But within the Socialist Party, there are many, many. The majority at this point is it becomes very quickly, it goes to the left. The revolutionary wing takes over
Yeah.
and gains all the reformists are marginalized, the moderates, and they identify very much with the Russian Revolution, but
Okay.
also with, say, for example, the Hungarian
Right.
Revolution. But they don't call themselves. They're a kind of fraction within the party.
Okay.
It's only when you get to January 1921 there's an official split and the Communist Party is formed. But I don't think that makes too much difference. I
Yeah.
think they're very clearly a revolutionary wing, and they talk revolution. I mean, they are they're often criticized. There's a kind of wing of historiography beginning already in the 20s, which basically blames them for what happened. So they're responsible for fascism because they taught for two reasons,
Yeah.
and there are two different wings.
Yeah.
One is they didn't make the revolution, and that would be a kind of IS analysis, I would say. You
Okay.
know,
Uh,
they weren't Leninist enough.
right. Right. Right.
They weren't sort of as good as Lenin as being Lenin, right?
Right. Right.
They were quite crap at that.
Yeah.
So they and the other wing is which is a more moderate take on it, which would say that they taught revolution, but they never intended to make it. So what they did was that it was the worst of both worlds. They scared everyone, like particularly the middle classes, witless, absolutely terrified of being expropriated. I wrote about this in my PhD years ago. They published books like "He who does not work shall not eat," which is actually a quote from the Bible. And we're going to abolish the middle classes. We're going to take away all property. This was kind of program of the party, right? Terrifying large amounts of people.
hmm
They actually do sack a lot of shops
Yeah.
in 1919. There's something called the cost of living riots, where hundreds, thousands of shops are looted. So they're terrified, but they don't have any. There's no real preparation for revolution. It's a lot of it is just words, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a great quote from a man called Nenni, who writes a very famous book about this period. He was also there at the time. Who said every village had its Marat or its Lenin, right? So you've got very people who are very good at making speeches and are very charismatic, but aren't actually, you know, preparing for a revolution, and therefore they're kind of very open to attack at that point.
Talk about a little bit more about this attack on the shops by the
So
left.
that's a big 1919. I think it's June, July. It becomes an almost nationwide. So there's been a very high inflation, and it's sparked in, I think, in somewhere in Tuscany, but it spreads very rapidly. And in Milan, for example, 270 shops are looted in a day. And I mapped that out
It's
years ago when
massive.
I worked on this for my PhD years
That's
ago.
massive.
Yeah, it's big and it terrifies. Actually, the people who keep order are the trade unions in this situation. The trade unions stop it and say, this isn't
But
what we're about.
what on
But
earth was what on earth was the analysis by these intellectual socialists that led them to attack shopkeepers? They
it
blamed
wasn't,
them for
no,
the
they weren't,
oh
it wasn't led. This was very spontaneous from below.
oh
This is sort of a riot, really.
oh
The intellectual socialists were absolutely horrified, but
oh okay
but they
yes
weren't in charge of it.
I
But
see
some of the people involved were socialists, like the socialist base or
I see
anarchists or whatever. But but it came out of the atmosphere
gosh
of post-war. It was there were reformists who were absolutely saying this is the worst thing in the world. That we don't. This is chaos. We're not about this. The revolutionaries probably a bit more ambiguous on it. But it terrified people. It terrified people. There's another general strike there's an international general strike in favor of Russia, also in July, I think, of 1919, to which Italy very strongly adheres, and basically closes down Italy for a couple of days. So one of the things the fascists also organize against is strikes. And they start to, for example, you see fascists driving trams during strikes, or, you know, digging coal or whatever,
Yeah.
metaphorically speaking. So they're also saying we will stop the strikes, we will bring order to this chaos. We're the only people who can save you. They're also saying that.
Wow. I have to say, reviewing your work and your take on and sort of just your perspective on it from the street level, which I just find so important and interesting. But you got to tell you, you made your the effect from on me has been, if I lived in a city where 270 shops got sacked in one day and there was a general strike on behalf of the Bolsheviks that shuts down my whole society, I'm probably gonna put on a black shirt. I mean, or at least be sympathetic to it. It's my God, what an environment in which to build a totalitarian political movement. I mean, it was handed to them. I mean, what could be better for the rise of fascism than those two things in that same what summer was it, right? I mean, it was all happening very quickly as well. It was massive
Yeah,
and it
this
was
is like
all
less than a year after the war.
yeah, right. And right
Very
after the
quickly.
war too. My gosh.
Yeah, right after the war. Yeah, you got
With
all the soldiers coming, and there's also a lot of stories of people in uniform being attacked just because they're in uniform. A lot of hostility to. I mean, some of that is myth, but some of it isn't, and so there's also that kind of that division is becoming wider. It's very difficult, for example, to fly the Italian flag in some places in Italy, um, if or to commemorate the war. Um, so there's anti-war war monuments put up, which I also studied at one point, which are extraordinary things. None of them survived, so
huh.
we've only got the words. But monuments to the war, which say something like, um, you know, we put this monument up to denounce the capitalist class who murdered our sons, or something like that. And the fascists obviously react very badly to this.
Hmm.
So you have a very volatile situation for no, and I agree with you. I think you can understand why people were scared, and you can understand why maybe if they didn't become black shirts, they tolerated that violence because they saw it as bringing some sort of order
Yeah.
and peace. It's a strange thing to say that violence brings peace, but that's what they saw it as, and particularly amongst middle classes, property owning peasants, there was a base there.